The idea that someone belongs to God, right, is the general idea, right? So according to Zosima, right, and I'm paraphrasing, right, but as long as we belong to ourselves, we cannot really forgive others. Our deep egoism prevents it. We see this in a lot of different characters, right? We see this especially in Ivan, Katerina, Captain Snigorov, right? We see the egoism that really is preventing forgiveness. We see it even in Fyodor, because even though he's ashamed and everyone hates him, he still has his own self-image, his own idea of the buffoon, his own "oh, I'm so wronged, I'm a victim," right? There's a combination sometimes of pursuing oneself as a victim, but it's all about this egoism, right? And so what Zosima is trying to suggest when one is guilty of all before all, Zosima suggests that we can only be merciful if we belong to God, right? And if we belong to God, right, because as Jesus says on the cross, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do, right? The idea is that what you're saying when you forgive someone is, you are worth more to me than any petty injury, right? And the thing is, it can be difficult to do that. It can be difficult to do that because, let me just silence this guy. Sorry about that. It can be difficult to do that when, right, because of our own egoism. Like, how can I forgive them? I hurt so much, right? It's often difficult to let go of an injury, to let go of a hurt. What Zosima says is if we belong to God, right, if we offer God the worship of a son, then we forgive by disposing ourselves according to the Father's will. So we don't forgive because we want to forgive. We forgive because we ultimately belong to God, right? We give it. He is the one who gets to dispose of us. So the idea, right, is, mercy is impossible as long as we insist on belonging to ourselves. Right? Our deep egoism will keep us from being able, because if someone wounds us, particularly if they wound us very severely, right, that's a very hard thing to let go of. Our sense of our own sense of justice, right? How dare you do this to me, right? That makes it very difficult to let go of any injury, because we're thinking, that can't, because there is a natural human desire for justice, right? Like, because especially if we've been legitimately wronged, right? But the idea is that Jesus, who offers the Father everything, he offers mercy because everything that he gives, he disposes according to the Father's will. And Alyosha, who's the son of Zosima, right? His idea is he is going to do whatever his elder tells him to do. He's the one who has the freedom of mercy because he no longer belongs to himself and he no longer carries the deep egoism of himself. And that is what is allowing him to be able to exist in this mercy. But as long as we belong, that's what we mean by this idea of holding on to the strain, holding on to the wound, holding on to one's idea and self as a victim, right? It's all about the idea of belonging to oneself and connecting to this deep egoism. But if we belong to God, we are guilty of all and for all. The idea of being guilty of all and for all is not to shame oneself, but rather to be connected to all sin and to Christ simultaneously. Because as you see, right, Christ, who did not know sin, became sin for us so that in him we could become the righteousness of God, right? If we don't know the idea of this, right, remember how Christ, right, he takes on the sins of the world. So basically, right, what Zosim was saying is we take on the sins of the world, and in our humility, we share in the humility of Christ. If you didn't know this, right, part of the symbolism of the crucifixion, as Jesus says in the Gospel of John, just as Moses lifted up the bronze serpent in the desert. So everyone who looked at this serpent on the cross, serpent is a symbol of sin and venom, right? And if you look at the serpent of sin and venom, right, the sickness is somehow transferred from you to the serpent on the pole, right? That was what happened in the Old Testament in the desert. Those who were bitten by the serpents, right, could look at the bronze serpent on the pole and be healed. It says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. So Jesus takes on all the venom, all the sinfulness of the world. And the reason why this becomes important in pro and contra, and I know this has been a really long introduction, but this is the essential reason why we have to look at this, is that the idea of being guilty of all is not to make one think I'm so bad, but rather to simply level the playing field, but also to see one as being fundamentally in union with Christ. Because Christ, by taking on the sin of the world, he, even in that sin, we are in union with Christ because Christ takes it on and forgives it. That is not an encouragement to sin, but the idea of humility is to see that, right, what other people think, it really doesn't matter. What really matters is God's love for us. God's love and nothing else matters, and God's forgiveness and nothing else matters. But to be connected, to understand, right, and this is, again, as the other day, one cannot be connected to Christ authentically without being connected as a son of the Father, right? Meaning to see oneself as being not belonging to oneself, right? But this also implies the love of neighbor and the responsibility to one's brother. We remember the story of Cain and Abel, am I my brother's keeper, right? Abel is a proto-Christ slain by Cain. And the idea that Dostoevsky is getting at is that you cannot be holy by being just by yourself, by being the Ferapont idea, right? You have to be you cannot be in union with Christ unless you're also in union with your brother. You cannot be in union with Christ unless you're willing to forgive. You cannot be in union with Christ unless you're also seeing that fundamental relationship of belonging to the Father also means this idea of like filial worship, right? Filial, right? Meaning the worship of a son to a father, and also the implied sacred connection with all of your brothers, right? And this is the idea that the monk is supposed to live. Now, as I mentioned, this is pro and contra, and so all of that has been the pro, right? The idea of you got to let go of egoism, belong to the Father, and belonging to the Father, you also belong to your brothers as well, right? That's how it all gets connected. The contra, of course, is that all of this theology and all this very beautiful stuff only makes sense if you can believe in one of two things. Number one, you have to believe God is real, right? Which, according to Dostoevsky, is not guaranteed. He maintains attention to the poles. Number one, that evil can be overcome by good, which again, not guaranteed according to the contra that is going to be portrayed in this. And three, the idea, and this is more that somehow, right, it is all worth it. Right, and that is the other thing, because Ivan is going to make the point, right? It's like, is it really worth it? Is the glory of Christ worthy of a child who is raped and tortured? He says, is that how can that ever be worth it? And he actually will use that exact example in the text. And so this is all going to be the very strong other side of the pro and contra. Now you might wonder, well, why does all this matter going in? Well, it matters because we see in these two earlier chapters, we see Lies and Alyosha. And in the first part with Lies and Alyosha, we have Lies tries to take it back, right? She says, "Oh, I really do love you after all." And she's like, "Will you serve me? Will you submit to me?" And Alyosha says, "Yes, I will." Like he's like, "I knew you really loved me. I knew you were lying." And it's hard to know. It's hard to know how naive Alyosha is and how wise he is. But what he's willing to do, because of his elder says he needs to go out in the world, Alyosha is willing to submit to Lies. Meaning like if they're married, he's willing to basically obey her and do what she wants him to do, as long as it's not too important. Meaning that he would not do things that are evil for her. And so Lies is willing to. What Alyosha is willing to say to Lies is like, yeah, I'll marry you. I'll still love you, and I'll do anything as long as it's not sinful, right? I will submit to you in all things as long as. I will submit to you in all things as long as you're not asking me to do moral evil, and then I won't. And that's and again, it's really strange that Alyosha is willing to just put his heart out there and is willing to get betrothed like this, and he's willing to submit to this silliness. Now, this scene is kind of balanced by on both ends by Madame Koklukov. So if we think about Madame Coke, right? I'll spell it like the soft drink this time. If you think about Madame Coke, right? The first thing she does, she talks about how one has to be pragmatic and reasonable. But the very first thing she does is she's going literally crazy about how Katerina has had a fainting spell because of what happened with her and Alyosha and Ivan previously. Right? She's like, send for the doctor. It could be a brain bleed. I mean, she literally is the most flippant and the most volatile and the most unpredictable person. Right? She is a huge drama queen. She's the queen of drama queens. She's the empress of drama. And when she is listening at the door between Alyosha and Lies, she's like, you were just humoring her, right? You don't really mean it that you're betrothed. You're just humoring her, right? Because she's a sick and silly girl. And Alyosha says, no, I'm perfectly serious. And she's like, well, you can't be serious, and I'll take her away, and we'll travel away. And so she's already making a decision to leave for the next 18 months to keep those two apart. Because she's like, because you two in the next 18 months, you'll get together and break up a dozen times and nothing good will ever come of this and everything. And so Madame Koklukov is talking about how one has to be practical and one has to not do rash things, right? Like that's her whole point. And yet she has been rash and is like, well, I'm going to take my daughter away now. I'm going to move, because she has a crush on you and because you seemingly are taking it seriously, right? She's this character who, again, is constantly being moved by the passions. And even though she's saying one needs to be practical, one needs to be reasonable, one needs to not be intemperate, at the same time, she's the most rash and unstable character. And that's what makes her so wonderful in terms of her ability to amuse and delight. And so the whole idea about this is that this contrast is that he knows that Lies is fickle, right? She's silly and sometimes cruel, right? Alyosha knows that, and he's willing to submit to her anyway. He's willing to humor her anyway because he believes that because the elder says you need to go out into the world, he thinks it's a sign from God. Thinks, okay, well, this is the way I'm supposed to be holy. This woman loves me. She's imperfect, but I will love her. I will do everything I can to make sure she gets to heaven. And that will be the way in which I learn to love. But the idea is, again, he's not thinking about his own happiness. He's only thinking about his own obedience, right? And the interesting thing is, by not thinking about himself, Alyosha is probably the only one who's consistently not miserable throughout the whole novel because he's thinking just about doing what he's supposed to do. And so in submitting to Lies, right, the idea is that, right, Alexei, right, is looking to not belong to himself. Right? That is the main idea that is being put. And then we have the opposite. The opposite that is being put on display is Smerdyakov with a guitar. Right. Smerdyakov is basically in a pretty location, near the grounds of his family's estate, or his father's estate. He's not really a member of the family because he's a bastard, and he's entertaining a young girl with his guitar, and he's singing in a falsetto, higher, and he sings rather sweetly, and he's be able to sing and rhyme, and she is absolutely swooning over Smerdyakov. And the whole point of this scene, Smerdyakov with the guitar, is the general idea that what we are ultimately seeing is he does like the attention, right? He wouldn't just, he apparently is liking the attention for some reason, but he also is treating her like crap. Smerdyakov wants to be admired and adored and everything else. He likes attention. But the thing is, she is totally willing to just throw her heart at him, right? And Smerdyakov is just kind of like very dismissive of her generally. And the main thing that we see is that Smerdyakov, he talks about how Napoleon should have actually conquered the Russians. It would have been better if the intelligent French had conquered the Russians, which is about the most un-Russian, horrible thing you can possibly say. It's another way to, it's another way for the author, like in giant big bold letters, to go, this guy is evil, right? This is the villain. But, he sings sweetly in verse, and she's like, oh, you sing so sweetly. It's not that sweet. Oh, it's so good that you can rhyme. Rhyming is stupid, right? He's putting her down, her appreciation, because she's not really able to, quote unquote, appreciate his real giftedness. He doesn't want her appreciation because she's not smart enough, she's not pretty enough, she's not wealthy enough. He considers herself beneath him, in spite of the fact that in terms of social standing, Smerdyakov is actually beneath her. She actually comes from means. He doesn't. He's a bastard. He has no station whatsoever. But he says, if only he'd been born in different circumstances, then the world could able, to appreciate his genius, his intelligence, his giftedness. You're not able to appreciate. I think so. And he says, here's some things that he says, right? So Maria, she's talking basically, she's flirting with Smerdyakov constantly, as if theirs are so much better than ours, meaning they're gentlemen. I wouldn't trade a certain gallant I know for 3 of the youngest Englishmen, Maria said tenderly, no doubt accompanying her words at that moment with a most languid look, meaning, she's basically saying, I'm in love with you. I wouldn't trade you for 3. And he says, folks have their preferences, miss, right? And he's just totally dismissing it. And you yourself are just like a foreigner, just like a real noble foreigner. I tell you so, for all that I'm blushing, right? So you're like a noble, exotic person born in, out of Rhodes. When it comes to depravity, if you want to know, theirs and ours are no different. They're all rogues, only their walks around in patent leather boots, and our swine stinks in his poverty and sees nothing wrong with it. The Russian people need thrashing, miss, as Fyodor Pavlovich rightly said yesterday, though he's a madman, he and all his children miss. So he's saying, yeah, everyone in Russia just needs to get their ass kicked, says Smerdyakov. But you respect Ivan. And he says, yeah, but he called me a stinking lackey. He considers me as maybe rebelling, but he's mistaken. If I had just so much money in my pocket, I'd have left long ago. He's like, no one can appreciate my cooking. No one except foreigners in Moscow can appreciate specialities, right? No one can appreciate me. I am beyond. I am sophisticated. Everything about this is all about, and so we have Alyosha, who everyone thinks is the most wonderful person. And he's just looking to give himself away to someone who seemingly is so fickle and so ungrateful. Well, Smerdyakov, who has someone who's actually, in terms of social class, too good for him in a lot of ways, she's willing to, basically give her all of her love, all of her worship, all of her devotion to the sweetly singing, rhyming guy with a guitar, and he's not interested, right? It's the consummate opposite. But the difference, right? What is Smerdyakov representing? And what he's representing, obviously, is egoism. And what's interesting is we know is Smerdyakov is the bastard, right? He's not a real member of the family, right? He's not a true brother, right? Not a true brother, doesn't have a true father, even though Fyodor is probably his father. Being a bastard, right? The idea of Smerdyakov being the bastard son is that not having a father and not having a true sense of belonging, right? We have this connection, right, between having the love of God and also showing love, right? Familial love to one's neighbor. And so because you can't not love your neighbor and love God at the same time, according to the Zosima theology, right? Smerdyakov, it makes sense that he's the one who's kind of anti-love, pro-egoism, because as a bastard, he's an orphan, he's alone, right? And so the idea of Smerdyakov is this idea of kind of like the orphan spirit. I have no father, no one for being connected to anyone. So I must be loved for my talents alone, right? No one can love me except for what I can do for them because I don't really belong to a family. And no one here can appreciate my talents, right? So he puts his worth in his ego and his what he thinks is his extreme intelligence, his ability as a cook, etc., right? And so you have his character foil, Alyosha, the true brother, who is just trying to do everything he can for his father, everything he can for his older brother, Mitya, Dmitri, everything he can for Ivan, right? And so these different attitudes, right, these different attitudes toward God and egoism have all to do with, being related with family belonging, right? Alyosha, belongs. And so he loves, right? He belongs, he's valued. And therefore, because he's already valued and secure in that value, he doesn't have the same necessity of the ego that Smerdyakov has. But because Smerdyakov is basically totally unvalued, except for a little bit of entertainment that he can give to Fyodor from time to time and his cooking abilities, he has to have an ego because he doesn't have any other way to justify his worth. One of the most important things about this is that Alyosha makes a startling confession to Lies in this section, and the confession he makes is a startling confession that he's not even sure he believes in God, which is a phrase he doesn't even know where it comes from, right? And he never would have said that before, but what he's really meaning is he has doubts, right? And yet, in spite of his doubts, he is still driven to be this extremely saintly person, right? And all of this has this idea of, knowledge of fatherhood and belonging, right? Alyosha is not exempt from intellectual doubts about the existence of God. He needed to say it. That was his vulnerability. He's like, I'm not even sure I totally believe in God in that sense of the intellect, but he does seem to know God in the sense that he knows fatherhood and he knows belonging, right? And that's the thing, right? Both he and Smerdyakov are completely capable of understanding both the intellectual arguments for and against the existence of God. Smerdyakov doesn't think there is, neither does Ivan. That's going to come into a more sophisticated bent later. But the key is that their different perspectives are contingent on their perspectives about egoism and belonging and family. And the main thing is after he interrupts them, right? Basically, this was the conversation that has us. Will my brother Dmitri be back soon? Alyosha asked as calmly as he could. Smerdyakov slowly rose from the bench. Maria rose too. Why should I be informed as to Dmitry Fedorovitch? It's not as if I were his keeper, Smerdyakov answered quietly, distinctly, and superciliously. But I just asked if you knew. I know nothing of his whereabouts, and I have no wish to know, sir. But my brother precisely told me it was you let him know about everything that goes on in the house and promised you let him know about when Grushenka comes. Smerdyakov slowly and imperturbably raised his eyes to him. And how were you pleased to get in this time since the gates have been latched for an hour already? Right. He asked, looking fixedly at Alyosha. So basically, right, what Alyosha, this is a short conversation, but here's the key idea, right? One, right? Smerdyakov is a liar, right? Because, he says, I don't know where Dmitry is and I have no way to get a hold of him. But Alyosha simply says, but Dmitry told me that if Grushenka comes, that he can ask you where she is. So clearly Smerdyakov is playing both sides, right? He doesn't even respond to that. He also says, right, this idea of egoism versus taking care of one's brother, right? Am I my brother's keeper, right? This is a reference to Cain and Abel, right? This is the complete lack of brotherly love, right? And this goes back again to egoism and belonging to the self. But Smerdyakov is clearly lying to Dmitry and manipulating him. And when Alyosha is about to point this out, Smerdyakov then just turns on the accusation, like, how did you get in here? The gate's been locked. And it wasn't that hard. He just got over the gate. He got over the fence, the same way that Dmitry or others have done many times before. But the whole idea, right, is that Smerdyakov, when he's basically caught in a lie, he attacks and says, well, what are you doing here? What makes you think that you belong here? When, of course, Alyosha belongs there, right? There's no reason why Alyosha wouldn't belong there. But Smerdyakov is the one, again, who is trying to push Alyosha on the outs. But the main thing is that he wants to get rid of him. The thing is, he does say that Ivan was waiting for him at a restaurant, or that Ivan was waiting for Dmitry at a restaurant, and there he might be able to find him. And so Alexei is looking for Dmitry, right? And Smerdyakov just wants Alyosha to go away. And so he says, well, Ivan wanted Dmitry to meet him at a restaurant. And he says this only, he says he's in a private room at a restaurant. And that's another lie, by the way. But the idea is that Alyosha is going to be then willing to go in a hurry away in order to get to Ivan and in order to begin to deal with the situation. So I'm going to stop here, and then we'll talk about the brothers get acquainted.